Hi everyone, welcome to Difference Frames the World, a place to view world affairs from a different angle. Although we have been demonetized for 9 months, and the platform has not paid us a penny for our work for over 10 months, we still try our best to upload at least 2 videos each week. We published 3 episodes about the United Kingdom, and here comes the 4th one, discussing the First Opium War in the early 1840s, which accelerated the decline of the corrupted Qing Dynasty and forcibly opened China to the world. Since the signing of the Nanjing Treaty in 1842, the first unequal treaty forced upon China by the British invaders, 180 years have passed. For nearly 200 years, China has suffered from numerous invasions, riots, wars and humiliations, and today it is eventually back on the right track. In the 1820s, China's Qing Dynasty was still the world's biggest economy, beating Great Britain and all its colonies worldwide and accounting for 1/3 of the world's total GDP. In 2014, China overtook the United States, becoming the world's biggest economy measured by the World Bank using the method of purchasing power parity. The total industrial output of the United States, Japan and Germany added together cannot beat China's total manufacturing GDP. The United Kingdom, however, is becoming insignificant. 2 of its previous colonies, the United States and India, have overtaken it, becoming the 1st and 5th economies worldwide. In the First Opium War, around 4,000 British invaders attacked China, which claimed to have hundreds of thousands of troops. It then forced the Qing Dynasty to sign the first unequal treaty, almost converting China into another British colony like India if other imperialist powers had not interfered. China was big and rich, and Western powers like France, the US, and Germany did not want the United Kingdom to control China alone. It was worth mentioning that Russia and Britain were against each other for a long time regarding China, particularly in Xinjiang. The Russian Empire grabbed the most land from the Qing Dynasty and the Republic of China, and the British Empire created the most headaches between China and its neighbors. For instance, today's border dispute between China and India arose from the British. China's decline from the world's pinnacle to a quasi-colonial society after the 1840s started with the First Opium War, which the United Kingdom initiated to protect its drug dealers. The causes of the First Opium War are complex. Still, the most important reason is that Britain started the war to recover the trade deficit, open the Chinese market and facilitate the dumping of its products. Britain was the first country to initiate the first industrial revolution, in which machines liberated human hands, making it possible to mass-produce cheap goods. And China, as a large country, was bound to make the British capitalist feel covetous. They hoped to dump their industrial products in China to make more money. European countries' heavy reliance on Chinese silk, tea, porcelain, and other goods caused severe trade deficits. In those days, China was an agricultural nation, and in 1757, the Qing Dynasty closed all ports except Canton, now called Guangzhou, to do business with foreigners. Only 13 specific merchants could trade with Westerners on the central government's behalf. The Qing government took most of the profits from foreign trade with the Western nations. British capitalists wanted to sell cheaper goods to China, but the Chinese people were self-sufficient and usually did not buy commodities from abroad. As government-controlled merchants decided the prices of imported goods, they were not motivated to sell Western nations' products at lower prices even if they could procure them at meager costs. As a result, the West had to buy Chinese products at higher prices, but could not dump their cheap, mass-produced commodities in China. Hence, the world's silver flowed to China, causing colossal trading deficits. Britain was particularly anxious to sell more products to China. It wanted to turn its disadvantageous trading position around, so it encouraged drug dealers to smuggle opium to China to poison the Chinese, and millions of taels went outside China. For over 100 years before the founding of the PRC in 1949, China had suffered from drugs, and opium had severely damaged the country's health and wealth. China is one of the most stringent countries in punishing drug traffickers, and the Chinese government detains drug addicts in exclusive rehab centers till they entirely abstain from the drugs. On the contrary, Western nations are now suffering from drug abuse, and some countries even legalize the use of certain drugs, like cannabis, in Canada and some US states. In Canada's big cities like Toronto, the government sells marijuana to the public and sets up specific care centers to help drug addicts take shots. In previous videos, we talked about a Canadian drug trafficker who was sentenced to death in China, and the Canadian government and some officials even appealed for his release. Ironically, Western countries will take good care of drug dealers and addicts, but do not care for hundreds of thousands of homeless people. We can find professional or amateur beggars on Toronto's streets, highway exits, and entrances, which one can rarely find in China's major cities. Most Western governments do not care for homeless people, but on the pretext of protecting human rights, they appeal for humane treatment of drug dealers who ruined hundreds of households. The British government even launched a war against China for opium smugglers, the First Opium War, in the early 1840s. Before the First Opium War broke out, the amount of opium imported into China by the British increased year over year. British opium traffickers colluded with corrupted officials in Qing Dynasty's customs and local governments to import opium into the mainland, and even the Guangdong Navy was in the business of smuggling opium. As a result, Britain's trade deficit was gradually reversed, and there was a massive outflow of Chinese silvertails to Britain. Lin Zexu explained the harm of opium to the Daoguang Emperor and stressed that the greatest threat to the imperial court from opium smuggling was the lack of soldiers to defend the nation, and the lack of money to keep the country running. The Daoguang Emperor started large-scale campaigns in some parts of the country to ban opium imports and sales. Guangdong was on the front line of the opium ban. Lin Zexu was in charge of banning opium in Guangdong, and his uncompromising attitude angered the British government and its war criminals. In those days, the Qing Dynasty and the British Empire were two significant world powers, and Britain was aware that China was a big country, and it was wondering whether the United Kingdom could win the war if it started. Moreover, some British officials and capitalists were afraid of losing the Chinese market, so the British were uncertain about whether to start a war at that time. The conflict between China and Britain began in 1839, but only in June 1840 did the British begin to build up their forces on a large scale. Before that, Lin Zexu and other Chinese officials even thought that Britain was too scared to attack Guangzhou, but the reality was that the British were unifying their opinions. In June 1840, the Opium War between the British gunboats and China's spears began, and it ended with the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing, which declared the failure of the Qing Dynasty. The Treaty of Nanjing was China's first unequal treaty with foreign countries. However, it was also an equal treaty, as the British only wanted to use the Treaty of Nanjing to achieve equal trade status between the two sides based on the position of free trade. The Qing Dynasty had to open its door to the world, which was good for China. After China failed in the First Opium War, the Chinese intellectuals began to view the world from a different angle, and a famous thinker, Wei Yuan, became the first Chinese to open his eyes to the world. His slogan, "Learn from the barbarians to deal with them," kicked off the campaigns in China, learning from the West. In the late 1840s, Wei Yuan visited Macau and Hong Kong, and the advanced capitalism there surprised him. It is worth mentioning that Wei Yuan was born in Hunan province, where many famous Chinese leaders and politicians were from, like Zheng Guofan and Chairman Mao. The First Opium War and the following defeats also wakened Chinese officials like Li Hongzhang and Zhang Zhidong, who started China's first industrial revolution. When we look back at history, the First Opium War started 2 centuries of humiliation. Even today, some Chinese opinion leaders still think the West is superior to China. However, many Western nations, like Spain and England, the 2 most famous colonist countries, have almost become third-world nations. The British forced China to open its door to the world in the 1840s, and 140 years later, the People's Republic of China took the initiative to implement the Open Up and Reform policy, which started the most remarkable economic growth in world history. After 40 years of quick development, China has become the world's real superpower, overtaking the United States in many areas. The British Empire, which used to control numerous colonies worldwide, is a different case. Most British colonies declared independence after World War II, and the whole country might fall apart shortly if Scotland and Northern Ireland separated from London. The UK is no longer a global power. Even in Europe, it has also been marginalised. Still, the new British Prime Minister, Liz Truss, regards herself as the leader of Britain and the world. but for most people worldwide, she is more like a British toad, capable of jumping and shouting only. Before ending episode 4 of the series, we want to thank our supporters and patrons again for their continuous support, which has kept DFTW surviving for so long without payment from Google. We also need to thank YouTube's advertisers for putting advertisements on our videos, which means our videos have brought value for them to promote their products and services, even though YouTube keeps all advertisement income without paying us a penny for our work. However, we cannot work as volunteers to increase Google's revenue and boost advertisers' sales, as Mark and I have our families to support. Hence, we can only publish 2 videos each week, and we need to work on other projects to make money for ourselves. Please help DFTW survive longer through donations via PayPal, Patreon, GoFundMe, WeChat, and Buy Me a Coffee.